all the participants who have come in large numbers today. It's a great surprise to me that there has been so much webinar fatigue that has set in today. And in spite of that, we see close to, I don't know, about 400 registration or whatever number. It's been very good. But what we find is that innovation has become name of the game. So today's subject, innovative structures for promoter incentivization in Indian PE deals. I think we chose to now share the innovations that we have done. And as many of you might be aware that since 2014, consistently for 5, 6 years, we have been ranked at the top on most innovative law firms in whole of Asia. And the reason behind innovation, and what is innovation? Let me put it in simple words. Innovation is nothing else but finding solutions to complex problems by unique or unprecedented structures. So, as a law firm, we spend almost 40% of our time on research, academics, thought leadership, and other kind of work we do in academics and whatever it is, right? Now, why we do this research? One, to find solution, and because today every deal looks similar but is not identical. When deal progresses, you have number of different issues that you confront, and immediately on the spot at times, as soon as possible, you have to find solutions. And therefore, we do a lot of simulation of business models. We try to simulate the negotiations and stuff like that, and be in the state of preparedness to really find solution at the speed of thought. And as I was mentioning, that our principle and the premise on which we work is we like to do highest quality work in shortest possible time. Otherwise, lawyer's model is more time we spend, uh, more benefit we get. I think that's not something that we like. We like to do research ahead of time, be prepared so that in a shortest possible time we can do a lot more work. And therefore, as far as NDA is concerned, its DNA has become, it's almost synonymous to the innovation, especially in the legal arena and the tax field. And we have innovated a lot of models, right? Even in the asset management industry, right from 1991 to P M&A deals and stuff like that. Some of you will be receiving some of our materials as well. But what we have tried to do in last about 4 months, we have done close to 200 up or maybe 250, I don't know, webinars, which we call cCep, Clients Continuing Education Program. Just like, you have continuing education program for professionals or for sometimes law school students and other ones. We think for clients also it's very important to undergo education today. That's the name of the game, and that keeps us on the edge, and that keeps us up to the date with a lot of things that we do. And most importantly, we have put most of our research work, including innovations and other things, you know in public domain. You will have received number of papers and number of other kind of stuff. So that is another thing that we like to do: sharing, caring. We're in the profession of law, we are not in the business of law, and therefore we think that sharing and caring is an important part of our culture and DNA. And I hope this would be very useful to all of you, and it will be very nice to interact with those who have any curiosity or questions. We'll also take a lot of questions. Some of them we cannot respond. We'll make sure to respond them a little later in through emails or otherwise. But we don't like to let any question go unanswered. So just do participate. Let us have your comments, and it has been wonderful, wonderful to have you all. And thank you once again for joining us today in the midst of all the webinar fatigue that you have taken time off this afternoon to be with us. And maybe I can request my colleague Nishchal Joshipura to lead this today's discussion, and hope you will benefit out of this. And stay in touch, stay connected. Let us know your feedback, and uh, we are always willing to improve and do something. Thank you so much. Over to you, Nishchal.
Thanks, Nishith. And welcome to all the participants. Appreciate your taking out this 1 hour to attend this session, and we'll try our best to make this 1 hour worth for all of you and add value to this 1 hour. So let me start with some brief introduction before we move to the questions for the panelists. So as we all know, India has gone through a wave of change in the private equity styles in the last 2 decades. So if we see the first wave, which came from 2003-4 to 2008, we saw a number of minority private equity deals that happened in India, where promoters continued to own majority stakes. Then came the second phase from 2009 to 2012, which was a dull period on account of global financial crisis where hardly any investments happened. But what happened was there were a number of disputes that happened between the promoters and private equity funds with respect to exit of the private equity funds. And that's where lots of lessons were learned by the general partners or the managers, that there is a need to get more control over the portfolio companies so that the promoters don't take the P investors for a ride. And then the third phase that came was from 2013 to 15, 16, where from minority investment, we started seeing a wave of substantial minority investment where the investors started taking up stakes between 26 to 49% in portfolio companies, where the promoters continued to own 51% in those portfolio companies. With this phase, there was a lot of confidence which the private equity funds gained because negative control worked out quite well, and there were more checks and balances that were imposed on the promoter. And based on this confidence, we saw the wave of positive control transactions happening from 2015-16 onwards, where if you see in the last 6 years, we have seen number of deals where the PE funds have acquired controlling stake of more than 50% in portfolio companies. And in majority of the deals, the promoters have been diluted to less than 10 or 15% stake. And this is where it became important in the fourth phase to find out ways to incentivize the promoters, because this was the phase where the promoter shareholding had drastically reduced in the portfolio company. And how do you keep the promoters incentivized to ensure that the venture uh, is doing quite well, and the valuations keep increasing over a period of time? So what we are going to discuss today is with respect to this phase 4 on buyout funds and how to incentivize the promoters in case of situations where promoters are holding a very minority position. So in today's session, we are going to discuss the promoter incentivization structures in 3 or 4 situations. First one is when a P investor is partnering with a promoter in greenfield venture. The second situation is when a P investor is partnering with a promoter in a brownfield venture. So where there is already an existing venture with the promoter at setup and the P investor is coming in and buying out controlling stake. The third is a scenario where a P investor is partnering with a promoter to set up a platform, which could be a sector specific platform like a or IT platform, right, to invest in healthcare sector or IT sector. And the fourth situation is in case of M&A transactions, how do acquirers compensate the promoters or incentivize the promoters through earn-out structures? And we are going to discuss the legal and tax implications for each of these structures and how some of these structures can be designed so that overall, both the promoters and the P investor work together to increase the valuation of the company. So with this, let me start the panel discussion. My first question is to Aishwarya. Aishwarya, can you, before we go into the practical examples on each of these structures, can you throw light on what are the various laws one needs to keep in mind while designing promoter incentivization structures in India?
Sure, Nishchal. Thank you. So, one of the most important legislation to be considered while we are, structuring promoter incentives is the Indian Companies Act. Indian Companies Act, inter alia, while provides for management of a company, it also provides for issue of shares, stock options, warrants, sweat equity shares to individuals. Then we have our Foreign Exchange Management Act and the regulations thereunder, which lay down the conditions for subscriptions to shares of an Indian company by a non-resident investor, and also the pricing guidelines for issue of shares to non-residents. Then we have our tax laws, which lays down what how we can structure the taxation aspect. What is the tax impact of issue of shares or stock options or incentives to promoters? So, in terms of Companies Act, the first legislation that I'm going to talk about is we under the Companies Act we can issue different kinds of securities to a promoter. So, first starting off with equity shares or preference shares. So, your preference shares when your these promoters will have a preferential right over dividend or liquidation proceeds at the time of liquidation of the company. So these are typically what the shares that investors will want in a company. Then, apart from your equity shares and your preference shares, unlike for non-resident investors, your promoters can also be issued optionally convertible or redeemable shares because of there being no pricing restrictions if they are resident promoters. Uh, then, moving on to the other incentives that can be offered to promoters, being stock options, warrants, sweat equity shares. These are all covered under the Companies Act. So, under the Companies Act, uh, stock options can be granted only to permanent employees of the company or its holding company or subsidiary company or a director of the company, except an independent director. But there is a catch in terms of incentivizing promoters through options. And that is because the Companies Act doesn't allow issue of options to an employee who is a promoter or who belongs to the promoter group. And stock options are also not allowed to be issued to a director who by himself or through his relatives or body corporate directly or indirectly holds percentage of the outstanding equity shares of the company. So, the Companies Act also defines who a promoter is. So, promoter can be one who's actually mentioned in the annual return of the company, or who controls the affairs of the company either directly or indirectly, whether as a shareholder, director, or otherwise, or in accordance of whose instructions the board of directors of the company is accustomed to act. So, if you qualify as any one of these, it is very difficult to be issued stock options to a promoter who's even an employee. The only exemption available under the Companies Act, which also recently came, is the exemption for uh, entities or startups which are registered with the DPIT. So, as long as an individual is an employee and not a promoter or director holding more than 10% of equity shares in the company, he can be issued stock options. So, what are stock options? Stock options are the right given to a person to subscribe to the shares of a company at a future determined price. And they typically have an exercise price, which may be a very minimal or nominal value. And after paying the exercise price, the holder is entitled to these options or shares. Uh, Under the Companies Act and the rules thereunder, there is a requirement of a minimum vesting period for options, and that is 1 year. So at least there should be at least a minimum period of 1 year between the issue of options and their vesting. That is vesting as in by when I can convert these into shares. Companies are free to determine the exercise price of their shares based on their accounting principles. However, the issue with stock options is that they are not freely transferable and they are also not allowed to be pledged, hypothecated. And in case of listed companies, they have to comply with the SEBI regulations on issue of options. Uh, One of the important tax considerations on ESOPs is that while at the time of grant of options, they are not taxed, but at the time of exercise of the options by the employee, the stock options are taxed at the fair market value of these shares at the time of the grant of these at the time of shares as a perquisite or as part of salary income of these employees. So now, when these, at the time of grant exercise of these options, they are taxed at one level. Second, when after I exercise these options and I hold these shares, when I want to sell them, again I will be taxed depending on how long they have been held, whether they have been, whether it's short-term or long-term capital gains. But the benefit of this, while calculating my gain at the time of sale of my of my shares that I received after conversion of my options, the gain will be calculated based on the cost of acquisition will be based on the fair market value at the time of issuance of shares and not the exercise price, which may have been very low. And the terms of issuance of options is typically covered in a grant letter or agreement. The vesting of these options may be based on performance or time. And one of the key considerations as to what both investor promoters must keep in mind is to what happens when a employee leaves the company. How are the options treated? How are the vested options treated? How are the unvested options treated? How are the exercised options treated? Uh, then moving on, so as I mentioned, it is quite difficult to issue options to promoters because of the legal restrictions under the Companies Act. So one way it is done is also a trust structure. Then the other way in which promoters can be incentivized are by issue of share warrants. So share warrants again give the warrant holder a right to subscribe to the equity shares of a company at a predetermined price after a predetermined period. But here, typically, consideration may be paid upfront. And if you're looking at a non-resident promoter subscribing to these shares or share warrants, again, you will need to comply with the pricing guidelines in terms of how long can the warrants, within what is the period by under which you have to pay the entire purchase consideration. Then, under the Companies Act, another method of issuing or incentivizing employees or promoters would be sweat equity shares. So, as the name goes, sweat equity shares are shares issued at a discount of a consideration other than cash for providing know-how to the company. The Companies Act only says that they can be issued to directors or employees of the company. So as long as there is no restriction on issuing sweat equity shares to promoters, so as long as a promoter is an employee or director of the company, it should be possible to issue sweat equity shares to promoters. But the only catch with sweat equity shares is that they are locked in for a period of 3 years from the date of their allotment. And I mean, once I'm issued these sweat equity shares, it may not, I may need to wait for 3 years to transfer these shares. So that's about law. Over to you, Mr.
Thanks, Aishwarya, for explaining the theory that goes in designing some of these structures. But let's move to the practical insights on what in reality happens in PE deals. So, Rajesh, my next question is to you. You have been involved in many deals where you have designed promoter incentivization structures for PE funds and promoters with respect to greenfield ventures. Can you throw some light on how some of these structures are designed and what are the legal and tax implications?
Sure. Thanks, Nishchal. I think when we think about greenfield sort of deals where you have the complete whiteboard as your canvas, right? Where you have the flexibility and the ability to structure deals to get the right economics. Because ultimately, let's look at it from both perspectives, right? From an investor standpoint, what is the investor looking for? The investor is looking at really alignment with the founder. They want to ensure that at no point in time is the founder or the promoter working at cross purposes with the investor. So they want to ensure that, listen, if they are riding the upside, they want the promoter to ride the upside on similar terms, so that you don't have a situation where the promoter is not incentivized when they are getting upside, and similarly they don't want a situation where a promoter is incentivized even though an investor is not getting the upside. So that's an important element in terms of thought process behind which a investor approaches it. From a promoter standpoint of view, and the classical deals when you are thinking about greenfield deals is that Promoter has the idea, promoter has the execution capability, and has the vision. What the promoter effectively lacks is capital. So which means that the promoter is looking at ensuring that even though their ability to infuse capital in the business is limited, they do want to obviously ride the upside in terms of the growth of the business and in terms of execution of the idea. Obviously, just going back to what Aishwarya was pointing out, that while what are my classical structures, right? You set up a company. The ideal situation that which you have in many other foreign jurisdiction is that you essentially issue sweat or ESOPs to the founders. India, obviously, we are going to have the constraint in terms of ESOPs to promoters not permitted under the Companies Act. Sweat, while being permitted, has tax issues because the issuance of sweat itself relates into a taxable consequence for the founder or the promoter. So what you try and structure deals is to see whether can we have two or three different instruments for the promoters, right? One idea that we have sort of worked with quite a bit in the past is in terms of partly paid instruments, where we sort of have not necessarily warrants, but we have something like a partly paid preference shares or even a partly paid debenture. The reason around this is both a mix of regulatory constraints as well as tax, because from a regulatory standpoint of view, I can't do ESOPs, but nothing precludes me from doing a partly paid instrument to the promoter. It gets fully paid depending on the alignment, which is what I call whether what are the economic parameters that you want to put in to ensure that it is in the money, right? So let's say whether it's linked to revenue targets, it's linked to capital raise, whether it's linked to EBITDA. So you put in different kind of parameters on the circumstances at which point the partly paid instrument can potentially become fully paid instrument. You obviously don't make it fully paid up until the point in time there is a realization or a liquidity event that actually comes in on board. And the good bit here is that the ability to sort of price the conversion ratio, right? So that sort of comes in and works pretty well in most situations, except what I would call the regulated businesses. There is always a bit of a concern in terms of financial services, for example, partly paid instruments. Will the regulator be comfortable with it or not? But in most other businesses, the partly paid instrument is something that can actually work. The ancillary benefit that you get on the tax side is that your holding period effectively starts at the point in time when the partly paid instrument was actually provided, as compared to a situation where you have actually exercised it. So you get a longer buffer in terms of ensuring that you get a long-term capital gains tax treatment as compared to a short-term capital gains tax treatment. So the partly paid instrument is something that works well. I generally look at it as a better instrument than a warrant, purely because of the tax advantage that it gives you. Because in a warrant structure, again, you can build in pretty much the same economics that you want that you build in a partly paid instrument. But the difference is really at the time of exercise of the warrant, your holding period effectively starts again at that point in time. And I think the other challenge that comes in is that when I actually exercise a warrant and then I have issued shares at that point in time, there is always this ambiguity as to whether Section 56, which is really the income from other sources in terms of issuance of shares at a discount or premium, where there can be a tax consequence in the hands of the company or the founder, as to in a warrant structure whether that can actually apply, whereas in a partly paid sort of situation, no such set of ambiguity actually is there. So that's one aspect around it where I sort of work with a partly paid instrument. Second option is obviously playing with the warrant kind of structure. The other option is that which we've also seen is where the promoter or founder makes it fully paid up, but comes in as a fully paid but convertible instrument, whether it's a debenture or a preference share. but the conversion ratio sort of changes depending on the milestones which are actually met. And these are milestones which can sort of vary from situation to situation. A few examples in terms of what investors typically try to structure milestones around. One is your next round investment, which is your standard discount to the next round investment. Second is capacity building, especially if you're looking at infra projects. It is linked to sometimes capacity building. Third one is in respect of revenue. Fourth, maybe less in greenfield projects unless you're looking at a stabilized yield sort of portfolios where you look at EBITDA as a concept. So you try and link it up to different sort of economic parameters, and the other thing which also tends to happen quite a lot is MOIC, which is essentially a mean on the invested capital. So depending on what is the MOIC or the IRR, sometimes multiple which the investor is getting at the time of exit, they do want to sort of partake some of the benefits with the promoters. So what a standard sort of provision would be that if I'm getting, let's say, more than 2x MOIC, or if I'm getting more than let's say a 20% IRR, then there is a sort of a founder sort of catch up, or a founder sort of sharing structure which is there, where you're willing to share the upside beyond the 2x MOIC, or you're willing to share a portion of the IRR beyond the 20% IRR with the promoters. But for all of this, I think the important element is that there are two or three different ways, right? One is to say that I will do a sharing of the revenue or the proceeds with the promoter, no instrument, nothing which is there. So you're just saying I'm going to share it with the founder. The challenge with that is obviously tax, because especially in today's day and age, the spread between a short-term capital gains and a long-term capital gains, we are looking at close to 18 to 20% sort of spread which is there. So you always want to try and ensure that you don't fall into the short-term capital gains tax bucket, or even the ordinary income or income from other sources, where you end up at the highest tax bracket. So as I said, the first option is where the promoters, where the investor says, I'll just share this upside with you. You can take the cash. Problem is going to be tax. The second is where they say that, okay, I will issue sweat shares, or I will issue bonus shares only to you. Challenge again is going to be tax. So which is where the important element really comes in, that you need to have the ability for the founders to have some kind of convertible instruments there, which gives them the ability to sort of tweak around with the conversion ratios. While in classical deals, you always think of the fact that it is really the investor who comes in with a CCPS or a CCD, and their conversion ratio changes. But especially in structures where there is going to be a lot of movement around what kind of incentives promoters are going to get, you want to ensure that the promoters also have some of these instruments in play. And as I said, when you're starting off in a greenfield asset, it's literally a whiteboard. So you get a lot more flexibility to sort of think and plan some of these. So let me just pause there, because I don't want to take too much of a time. And Nishchal, let's go to you for a bit more complexity, which is when you're looking at brownfield deals, or deals which are midway through a stage of investment. How do you sort of then think of incentive structures? Because there obviously the parameters are slightly different, and the way you have to think about it is slightly different.
Sure. So let me divide this discussion into two parts: in an unlisted situation and in a listed situation. I think in an unlisted situation, the structure is largely the same as you mentioned in terms of partly paid instruments. But I would want to highlight one aspect, and maybe I can even share one of the live deals that we had done on a real-time basis. So this was a deal where a PE fund was acquiring around 60 to 65% in an Indian company, and there was a deal that was negotiated by the promoter, where if the EBITDA of the company in the next 2 years touches a certain number, the promoter will get certain shares for free in the company. And the way, initially when we started discussing the structures, one of the structures that came up was the warrant structure. But there are always two issues which the promoters face in these type of situations. First is at the time of entry, they don't want to put in 100% of cash for subscribing to that instrument, because one is they don't know whether the milestones will get achieved or not. And in that case, why give up the entire sum on day one? And the second issue that comes up is at the time of exit, they want to pay least amount of tax so that they can get more IRR on their investment. Now, the warrant structure solves for the first problem where you can just pay minimal amount, and then that takes care of the liquidity issue for the promoter at the entry stage. But warrant does not solve the tax issue, because when the warrants are converted into equity, which would happen only when the milestones are met, the holding period for the warrant start from the day the uh, warrants are converted into equity. And that is where the holding period for equity will restart from that day, in which case the promoters will have to wait for additional 2 years before the gains become long term in nature. And as Rajesh mentioned, the spread is also getting higher and higher between long term and short term, and hence there is an incentive for the promoter to use the instrument which does not result in such tax implication. And which is why instead of warrants, increasingly we have started seeing partly paid instruments being used, like partly paid debenture. And it not only works for the promoter, it works quite well for the investors too, because in a situation where the promoters don't achieve the milestones, then the investors just need to instruct the company to redeem their partly paid debentures, and that should not be too much of a concern, given that it's a debenture instrument. So some of the issues applicable to preference shares, on from which sources you can redeem preference shares, all those issues are not applicable to debentures. So this instrument works quite well for all company, the investor, and the promoters. Uh, Coming to the other structure in unlisted situation is the upside share arrangement, which is again becoming quite common in P promoter deals, where if the promoters manage to uh, give exit to the PE fund over a period of, let's say, 5 to 7 years at a certain IRR, then in that situation, any excess IRR earned by the PE fund above a benchmark IRR which has been agreed between the promoter and the PE fund, the promoter also gets a share from that excess IRR. And in unlisted situation, the way it is typically structured is in the form of a call option by the promoter on P fund shares, shareholding in the company at a very nominal value, obviously subject to exchange control regulations and tax and other issues. But uh, this is one way in which the promoters incentivize themselves, where the call option is exercised at a very low price. Or in certain situations, there is also a put option by the promoter on the PE investor, where put is done at a premium to the fair market value. And in most of the situation, even though the PE fund is a non-resident, because the PE fund will be buying at the time of put, paying more money towards acquisition of shares won't be a concern from an exchange control perspective, because for at the time of investment, there's a floor price that needs to be taken care of, and at the time of exit, the ceiling price needs to be taken care of, which will be the case in case of a call option by promoter from the PE fund. So these upside share arrangements work quite well in unlisted company situations. But where it gets complicated is in listed company situations, because of various laws which SEBI has enacted. And in fact, there was an interesting case that had happened in 2015, uh, where there were two private equity funds who had invested in a, a multiplex company, PVR. And there was a deal that was struck between the promoter of PVR and the private equity funds, where if the private equity funds exit beyond a certain IRR, then the excess from the excess IRR, almost 20% was going to be shared by the PE funds with the promoter. Now, at that time, there were no laws governing such incentivization arrangements between PE fund and the promoter. but there was a lot of hue and cry from the public shareholders on why these type of arrangements are taking place, because SEBI's view right from day one has been that all the shareholders of a listed company should be given equitable treatment. So promoter is not on a higher footing as compared to public shareholders, and hence any such arrangement need to be looked at by SEBI. And in fact, in that case, there were a lot of other issues on disclosures also. But after this PVR issue that came up, SEBI actually amended the laws, and there was a regulation 26 sub regulation 6 that was introduced in listing regulations, which now clearly provides that if there is any arrangement between a promoter or a key managerial personnel with any third party or a co-shareholder or with anybody with respect to the securities of the company, then there is a requirement to take prior approval of not just the board of the listed company, but even approval of majority of the public shareholders of listed company. So this has now become a norm, and some of the deals that we have recently structured, we have actually gone back to the shareholders to get their approval. And one of the good things about these upside arrangements that are structured is, one is these are all structured in the form of secondary transfers from the P fund to the promoter, where the promoter gets these shares at a very low price compared to the market price. Tax issues and other keeping those issues aside, but the promoters at least get incentivized for the work that they have done, because they get the shares from the PE fund at a very low price. Uh, uh, this is typically done through off-market deals, because you can't do these deals on market given the pricing difference between the ruling market price and the price at which the promoter has to buy the shares from the PE fund. Now, what happens in this situation is when this arrangement is done with respect to incentivization, the promoter and the P fund, given that now everything is going to be approved by the board and the public shareholders, that entire arrangement is blessed by the regulator and the public shareholder, and hence now there is no concern. uh, the two reasons why the public shareholders are now comfortable approving these arrangements is, one is it's a secondary transaction between two shareholders, and it does not dilute their shareholding in the company, and hence they are okay. And second is, typically these incentivization arrangements trigger only when the promoters have done something great with the portfolio company, which in turn is going to increase the valuation of the company. So if the valuation of the company is increasing, even the public shareholders shareholding valuation is also increasing. So because of these two reasons, we have seen most of these arrangements getting approved by the public shareholders. But it's very important to understand the nuances of the securities laws in India when we are structuring some of these arrangements. So I think, Rajesh, these are the issues and the structures that we have seen in listed and unlisted situations in uh, uh, brownfield ventures. But let me now get back to Harshita. And Harshita, my question to you would be, uh, uh, what are the structures that with respect to the instruments that have been issued to the promoters, right? What are the structures that you have seen, and what are the typical standards that you have seen with respect to vesting and clawback for the instruments that have been issued to the promoters?
Sure. Thank you, Nishchal. I think before anything else, in terms of incentives to the promoters, the most valuable asset that the promoter essentially holds today is the shares of the company. Now, besides being a shareholder and often with a controlling stake, the promoters also hold executive positions in the company. And given their dual role of being a shareholder in the company and having executive responsibilities at the same time, the investors in the company usually like to tie in the two roles into one. And which is why typically with a new investment round, it is common to see that the investors insist on escrowing of the promoter shares or lock, which is nothing else but the existing shares of the promoters are being locked up for a certain period of time. In line with the escrow and the lockup of the shares of the promoter or the promoter shareholding, there is a reverse vesting mechanism which is built in, which is either annual or quarterly, spread over a 2 to 3 year term. Depending on how it has been negotiated with their investors. And an interesting thing to note here is how the promoters, from the investors' perspective, how the promoter shareholding is tied up to his or her employment with the company. Now, in terms of treatment of the vested or unvested shares, if I may, use those terms, though it's not an ESOP that we're talking about here, it's a reverse vesting mechanism where the shareholding of the promoter is essentially locked up, and then, it's released in phases to the back to the promoter or unlocked in phases. So, in terms of the treatment of those shares, released and unreleased, we generally see a couple of scenarios. And what happens to these shares? One, when it's a termination without cause, or a resignation by the promoter. Two, when it's termination with cause, and cause may have a definition which is heavily negotiated between the investor and the promoter, where things like fraud, embezzlement, whether it's financial fraud, misconduct, or a couple of things are added. In terms of subjectivity. The second is what happens in case of an event of default happens by the promoter or a breach by the promoter of every covenant of the shareholders agreement. The third scenario is a liquidation event. Again, liquidation event may have different definitions depending on how you've negotiated it. Upon the occurrence of a liquidity event, if it leads to a termination of employment of the promoter, what happens to those shares and what is the treatment then? And the fourth and the usually less likely is upon the death or permanent disability of the promoter. Now, dealing with each of the scenarios separately, let's start with what happens in case of a termination without cause, or termination at will, as they like to as it is put. So usually resignation by the promoter and termination without cause in terms of consequence is generally clubbed into one. And what happens in these cases, what usually we've seen in deals is that the company can either buy back the unvested shares, or upon the board's determination, the promoter may be required to transfer the unvested shares to a third party. Now, the buyback and the transfer both happens at cost, and when I say both happens at cost, it is basically an agreed contractual mechanism where the investors insist that the whether it is a buyback or a transfer to a third party, that should happen at a price at which the promoter would have acquired the shares, or the lowest price permissible under law. Just to keep that thing tying in. And in these scenarios, the vested shares or the shares which have already been released to the promoters basis the reverse vesting mechanism remain untouched, because so basically the promoter is allowed to keep those shares, and it remains as is. Now, different from this is a scenario where the promoter's employment has been terminated for a cause, and again, agreed definition of cause could be multiple things in it. In termination for cause scenario, the company usually not only buys back the shares which have been released, but also the shares which have not been released, but also the shares which have been released. So the entire bucket of vested and unvested pool of shares is basically bought back by the company, or again, upon the board's determination, is transferred to a third party or a person which the board determines more appropriate in that scenario, at cost again. So again, both the transfers or the buyback happens at cost. And another interesting point here, just from a documentation perspective to note, is that when the board is making these decisions, and again, it depends whether your document says whose determination is going to be, whether it's the board or whether it is the investor who's going to determine which option to pick up upon the happening of that event. So if it is the board, the defaulting founder is, or the defaulting promoter is usually kept out of the board decision making process. So that's how it works. The third scenario, which is death or and again, the same concept in terms of uh, you know uh, both vested and unvested going back to the company or to a third party applies in case when a promoter is liable for an event of default due to an explicit action or inaction by the promoter, or a breach by the promoter. The same consequence applies. The third consequence is when it's a liquidation event which leads to a termination without cause. So again, if it leads to a termination with cause, it's a different consequence attached. But when a lick event leads to termination without cause of the promoter, or an IPO happens, then all the unvested shares are typically released to the founder. and the vested continue to remain with with the promoter or the founder, as the case may be. The other scenario that we have is death or a permanent disability of the promoter, in which case we have also seen, it's a mixed process that we've seen. What we've usually seen is there's a case of accelerated vesting, wherein the number of locked up shares which would have been released to the promoter in the next 12 months following the date of his demise or the last date of employment, in case of permanent disability, is usually accelerated and released to the promoter or his legal heirs, as the case may be. So there's an accelerated vesting to that extent. And in terms of anything that remains unlocked or unvested beyond the 12-month period, that the company either buys back or it gets transferred to a third party. So these are the typical, different scenarios in which one, we see the interplay of relationship between the promoter, between the promoter of the company and his shareholding and his employment, and how it's tied up, and the different scenarios in which he has to part with his shareholding, whether it is vested or it is unvested, depending on the situation at hand.
Sure. Thanks, Harshita. So Rajesh, I think switching from PE to M&A, given the COVID situation, what we have been seeing is more and more deals that are being negotiated have a higher earnout component, since the acquirer does not want to pay everything upfront to the seller or the promoter shareholder. And what we wanted to understand from you is what are the implications of earnout structures, and I understand there are certain tax issues also involved with respect to earnout for the promoter, especially when the promoter is in executive capacity, working for the portfolio company or the target company. So can you throw light on that?
Sure. So Nishchal, when we broadly think about this, right, there are two different concepts which are actually at play, right? One is a classical earnout structure, and the other is a deferred consideration structure. And fundamentally, the distinction between the two, very simply put, is that in an earnout, you're looking at potential future changes or potential future milestones being met, which are all contingent events, right? Basis which you are actually willing to tell the promoter that you're going to pay additional X amount. And in some sense, you are linking it to the fact that the promoter is going to continue with the business and going to sort of build or scale up the business. And therefore, you're saying that in lieu of the synergy benefits that you may potentially bring in and the growth that you're going to get in, I'm willing, if you meet certain targets or milestones, I'm willing to pay you an additional consideration. Deferred consideration, on the other hand, is very simply put, as in the consideration is being determined already, except that you're sort of tranching out the payments as such over a period of time. The challenge for all of it, right, in terms of when we think about structuring this, is largely driven by tax considerations. And there are two or three different issues at interplay here. The first one is the situation, especially when we are thinking about earnouts where the promoter is continuing in a management capacity and getting consideration at a future point in time. The first issue that comes in is that should the earnout be linked to the status of employment, or should it be linked to the transfer of shares or other securities in the company? We've had precedents in the past where sometimes courts have taken a view that, looking at the nature of the contract, that this was linked to effectively employment and tried to characterize it as employment income. So obviously the way in which you draft the contract becomes pretty critical. But the standard or the subject to drafting the documents in the right manner, you would normally get a capital gains tax treatment even around earnout. Once you say that, okay, it is not salary, but it is actually going to be capital gains tax, then the issue that arises is that what is the point in time when the accrual of capital gains has really happened? Because unlike for, let's say, something like salary income, for capital gains, what the provisions talk about is to say that capital gains will arise or is deemed to arise in the year in which the transfer of assets took place. So which means that, let's say if I have sold my shares today and there is an earnout component that is payable after 18 months or 24 months, there is a deeming fiction in law which says that the capital gains is deemed to arise in the year when the transfer has taken place. Now, even here, the courts have sort of tended to take a different approach, where they have said that, listen, if it's a deferred consideration absent any contingencies, the deeming fiction will come into play irrespective of when the transfer happened, irrespective of when the amount was actually received. So even though you're supposed to receive it after 18 months, you still have to sort of account for the taxes in year one and pay the taxes in year one. In case of earnout structures where there are contingencies, while there is a divergence of view, but there are enough judgments which sort of say that until the contingency has come into play, you cannot actually recognize income until that point in time. So therefore, you have to recognize it as income in the year in which the contingency got fulfilled. So, which is the other approach, and probably the right approach to my mind, which people take. And obviously, in all of this, there are certain elements which become important, because all of these earnouts are sort of linked to tenure of the person being in playing a role in the company. So from let's say a acquirer standpoint of view, you want to ensure that if there are circumstances where the founder wants to leave, that there is a sort of clawback, or there is a write-off insofar as the earnout amounts are concerned. From a founder standpoint of view, on the other hand, the way that you would always think about it, especially if it's a M&A which has happened to a strategic, you want to ensure that all the value is actually built into the company, and it's not a case where the value is sort of eroded and goes into the consolidated group, because the targets are all linked to the company. So a lot of this is sort of going to be driven by how do you sort of optimize for some of these risks. But obviously, I think both earnouts and deferred considerations have become much more routine now, and especially in this COVID situation, you're seeing people try and link up whether it is for valuation or whether it's for exits, in terms of not even the FY21 numbers, it's the FY22 numbers, because FY21 is sort of it's a sort of a FM sort of situation, right? So those are all sort of very interesting. But again, the thought process of approach in M&A on earnouts and deferred consideration is very different from how you would sort of think about it on a private equity and fundraise sort of situation. So let me pause there and sort of try and take up in terms of topics which we have otherwise left out. Nishchal, probably to you, in terms of other kinds of structures that you have seen, which will probably be useful for everyone on the forum.
Sure. So in fact, two other structures that we have seen and worked on have been, one is the structure where the P investor and the promoter are coming together to set up a platform, which would be typically a sector specific platform for, say, healthcare or IT or real estate, right? What we have seen here is, especially in case of healthcare platforms, is in addition to the structures that we discussed, one of the other structure that is also being discussed in the market and implemented is a structure where there are various verticals within the healthcare platform, and for each vertical there is a separate promoter who takes charge of that particular vertical of the healthcare platform. So you have a platform company, which is a healthcare platform company, which is like a holding company for the various verticals. And these promoters, instead of becoming shareholders of this healthcare platform company, they work like strategic advisors to this platform company, where depending on the investments that they do, the exits that they do, they are able to manage within their respective verticals. They are paid hefty fees by the platform company from the proceeds that are received from the exit. So that's one model that is also being used for incentivization of the promoters, or in this case, let's say the strategic advisors who participate in such ventures. The second model that we have used is in certain situations. These are the holdco structures which are used by the promoters, where sometimes the investor is not able to directly invest in the main portfolio company for variety of reasons. It could be, let's say, the cap for foreign investment has already got exhausted in the main portfolio company. Sometimes, the other shareholders have a consent right before any new investor can come in. Sometimes it is there are transfer restrictions that are there. Sometimes there are regulatory approvals that are required where it is not possible for a foreign investor to wait for so long to get the regulatory approval. So what we have seen is, in such situations, the foreign P investors, they come at the promoter holdco level instead of the main portfolio company level, and there they use the non-convertible debenture structure at the holdco level, and then holdco promoter holdco in turn then invests in the portfolio company. Uh, because promoter holdco will be an Indian resident, so some of the issues with respect to regulatory approvals from FIFP and those issues may not arise. Uh, where this helps is that the terms of the debentures issued by the promoter holdco to the foreign P investor are structured in a manner where the foreign P investor also gets equity upside on the investment that is made by the promoter holdco in the portfolio company. And there is there is a commercial that gets negotiated between the promoter and the investor, that if the promoter is able to achieve uh, the exit above a certain IRR, then the redemption premium on the NCDs will be so and so. If it is below a certain IRR, then the redemption premium will be so and so. So that way, the sharing of proceeds from the sale happens between the promoters and the P investor, where you can structure the redemption terms in a manner where anything that is not paid as redemption premium or return of capital will go to the promoter as a 100% equity shareholder of that holdco. So these are the two other structures that we have seen, which have been implemented by the promoters and the P investor. And I see some of these structures being used more and more, given the complex regulatory and tax environment that we were always in, but now added to that complex commercial environment too due to COVID, where some of these considerations would become more critical. So I think with this, we have covered more than 5 or 6 structures for promoter incentivization. And I think we are already running short of time. We're already at 4 p.m. Uh, uh, I don't think there are any questions, but if there are any questions, and we will separately respond to you given the paucity of time. But with this, I would thank all the participants who have joined and spent the last 1 hour with us. And we hope that you found the session useful and worth your time. Thank you so much.